Hello and welcome to week 3 at Introduction to Psychology. We just got done the chapter on research methods. So the first thing I want to talk about is actually that this week we have a special assignment that's due, and that is the correlation and decision-making assignment. So if we look in Brightspace here, I'm in the course timeline, and we'll see on week 3, we have our biopsychology content that I'll be talking about, but we also have the correlation and decision-making assignment. Now, the information for this assignment is in that first chapter in your course book called, conveniently, Special Assignments. And it's right at the front. It happens before chapter 1, per se. So that used to be at the end of the book, and next semester it's going back to the end of the book because it's been causing some confusion there. So, but here we are in this first chapter of our course book in special assignments, and let's take a look at just to see where this is. So here's that chapter, and you go right into the first assignment is the correlation and decision making. It goes through the information that you need. You have to read this for detail. How to do a calculation of a correlation in Excel. There's a link right there on how to do that. And then you're submitting your document here. It is an Excel file. You'll be uploading not a Word document, but an Excel file, and you'll be filling in all the parts that I'm asking you to do. Now, this relates to the content on research methods. We're talking about using statistics to make a decision. And so make sure that you spend some time looking at that particular part of the course and get that done this week. Now, the focus this week is actually on biopsychology. So as I move our course book into chapter 3, let's take a look at what I'm asking you to understand this time. Now, remember, always read the textbook, read the course book, watch these videos. It's the best way to prepare yourself for the expectations for the assignments at the end. So at the start, what we're looking at is essentially in the attention section, we look at nociceptors, which are specifically pain neurons. They're neurons that are specifically designed to communicate pain. And what this introduces is not only the name of those types of nerves, but that we have different types of nerves. They're not all the same. So some are specifically for gathering light, some are darkness, some are edges, some are color, and that's just in the eye, let alone our skin neurons. Some are for pain, temperature, pressure. Then we have receptors in our stomach that allow us to determine whether we feel full or whether we feel hungry and how that works with the brain. All kinds of different neurons, let alone the neurons that are just transmitting information from one place to another. So you have a pain neuron in your foot that says, I just stepped on a nail, and that has to get all the way to your brain so you can process it and then do something about it. And there are nerves that simply translate across the whole body and send that information from the origin neuron all the way to the brain. And the brain's full of neurons that process information. It's an amazing, amazing thing. And it's something that we explore in much more depth when we get into the course biopsychology, which is a whole course on this kind of content. But I'd like to take some time in this intro class to give you some insight into the amazing things that are about our nervous system. So we're going to be learning about different parts of the neuron and how that works. We'll be looking at the actual biochemical electrical process that occurs right in the synapse where you communicate from one neuron to another. We're going to look at different parts of the nervous system and look at the basic functions of the brain and the hemispheres. So here we go. As we go in, we talk about nerves. We have this neuron anatomy right here. And we'll see that the nerve is made up. This is sort of a generic picture of a nerve. We have the cell body. We have the nucleus, just like all nerves. Then we have dendrites connected to the cell body. And then one in this kind of generic depiction of a neuron, we have one particularly long neuron here that's just called the axon. It's or part of the neuron, I'm sorry. And then kind of dendrites on the other end, but then the axon terminals where communication from one neuron to the next is happening. And then you have myelin, which is a fatty substance that builds up on the outside of the axons that increases the electrical conductivity of that neuron so that the neuron becomes faster. Now, there's two areas in our world where that's important. That's in human development and in diseases of the nervous system, such as multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis is a degradation of the myelin on our nervous system, so the neurons become slower and slower to the point that they're no longer efficient. They can no longer support breathing or the heart rate, and ultimately a fatal disease. But it has to do with that myelin. It breaks it down. Now, in human development, we are born with relatively less myelin on our nervous system, so our movements are rather erratic. They're slow, they don't have good reaction time, and that's why we don't come running out of our parents. We kind of don't do a whole lot. As our nervous system becomes increasingly myelinated and it becomes faster, then coordinated movements become easier and easier, and you can see how a child develops over time. As there's increased myelin, they have more and more physical abilities. And so that's kind of the purpose of myelin is there. Now, myelin is also interesting in that it's colored white, and nerves are actually sort of a grayish color. So if you've ever heard of the concept of gray matter and white matter, is it's all nerves. The whole thing is nerves, but the white stuff is covered with myelin. So your spinal cord and a lot of your peripheral nervous system is white colored, whereas in the brain, where cells are very close together, there's not as much need for there to be developing of myelin. So the larger structures of the brain remain that gray color, which is the color of neurons. So kind of explains why we call it gray matter and white matter. So there's some explanations of some of the parts of the nerve that I've just been talking about. And here's a movie from Crash Course Psychology on the chemistry of this. And then going into the nerve impulse. And what I want to do for this is I'm actually going to kind of, there's videos on this, but I like explaining this. So I'm going to use my iPad here to kind of draw out what is happening. When the nervous system is communicating, the neurons actually don't touch each other. There's a small gap that we refer to as the synaptic gap in between one neuron and the next neuron that is in the flow of information from one point to the other. So if we look at it from the point of view of a set of neurons, the flow of information is going this way. So let's just say this is the pain in the foot, and this is the brain. Now we're going to look at a small part of this and look at two neurons that are along the way. And I'll really microscope it down here to, here's one terminal button, and here is another dendrite that's going to go on to the next cell. Okay, remember, information is going along this way. Okay, from the pain to the brain, we'll call it. Now, inside of each one of these, inside of the presynaptic part of the neuron, there are vesicles, and these vesicles contain neurotransmitters. Those are chemicals that are much like a key. You can imagine that these, because of the molecular structure of these, they're sort of shaped like a key. So let's just draw sort of like a rudimentary key, like this. That's the shape of the molecule. It's like an H. That's not real, but... And over here, there are receptors that maybe they look like this. And you can see how that H is going to fit in there. So these keys have the goal of crossing the synaptic gap and then finding points of reception on the postsynaptic neuron where they can attach and form a chemical bond. So here's what happens. As the electrical activity travels down the neuron, this is very fast, of course, okay? It causes these vesicles to move toward the surface of the neuron, and then they break through, and the neurochemicals are released into the synaptic gap. They float across, and when they land on a receptor site, and let's say we have that H goes there, that produces a chemical reaction in the postsynaptic cell that causes ion channels to open up in the cell. So sodium ions begin to go into the cell and increase the negative electrical charge. So we start to get a charge built up, an electrical charge that starts to build up on the surface of the neuron. When that charge, that electrical charge, reaches a certain potentiality, it releases and sends the electrical signal down to the cell and ultimately to the next neuron and to the next dendrites. This blows my mind. I hope it blows your mind too. It's pretty amazing structure built in within our bodies. And we call it biochemical electrical because there's biology with the cell tissues and whatnot. There's chemicals with the neurotransmitters, and there's electricity. There's actually electricity in our system, and that's how our system communicates. So if you've ever seen The Matrix, and they talk about all those bodies, all the people, humanity being locked cognitively into the matrix, but they're all little batteries. There's actually a little bit of truth to that. We do generate a certain amount of electrical charge, much like a battery. We're polarized to negative charge and positive charges and whatnot. And so we're like little batteries a little bit, and it's mainly because of our nervous system and this biochemical electrical process. So back into the course book, we have a little bit about the synapse here. We just kind of covered that. A little bit about athletes and how fast their nervous systems are. Lots of videos here, and we can see a video on multiple sclerosis here that goes into a little bit more detail. So let's look at the gross anatomy of the nervous system. And gross in this doesn't mean that it's yucky. It means it's the big parts. We just look at macro. When we look at cells and we look at the synaptic gap and that process, the biochemical electrical process, that's looking at the micro. Now we're looking at the macro, or the gross anatomy, large pieces of our anatomy, and we start talking about the brain and the nervous system. Now the nervous system, as is depicted here, is divided into two parts, and one is the central nervous system, the other is the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system, midline, the midline is the brain, brainstem, and the spinal cord. That part of a lot of processing and decision making at the neurological level, and of course at the cognitive level, go on in that area. The peripheral nervous system is everything else, from that pain neuron on your toe to the retina neuron that's just right close to the brain, but it's still peripheral to the brain. It's still outside. So we have a lot of peripheral parts, how our nervous system spreads throughout the body. Sensory neurons, motor neurons, affective, reflexive, all of these things, all of that's the peripheral nervous system. And then we have the central nervous system where there's lots of activity, bringing that all together from the peripheral nervous system for processing by the brain. In addition to the central nervous system, we also divide the nervous system into sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now, parasympathetic is, you can think about it this way. This is how I try and remember it. The parasympathetic is an activating system. Let's say you might have heard of fight or flight reactions. So something happens, somebody cuts you off, and there's a number of reactions that happen very rapidly in the brain. There's release of steroids into your bloodstream and adrenaline, and there's an activation of the system getting ready to react to a potential threat. Now that includes a constriction of the blood flow to the internal parts of your body. It's the sweaty palms. It is the tensing of muscles. It's the widening of the pupils. It's the shallowing of your breath, and it's the raising of your heart rate. You're getting ready to fight or getting ready to run away. Kind of evolution gave us these tools. So that parasympathetic system is the one that activates us. I like to think of it para like parachute, like it's the thing that's going to rescue us. So that's just my way to remember it. And then we have the sympathetic system. We can kind of think of it like sympathy is the part that calms us down. So it gets us to relax. It takes care of all of those parts of our activated nervous system and lowers our heart rate. And we can activate that through, that's what you activate through meditation, through closing your eyes and deep breathing. You're actually activating the sympathetic nervous system to relax the body back to where it is. And those systems are going all the time. We get activated, activated, unactivated. Think how the whole body system works. So when we look at the brain, here's another one of those videos, really great, and it has they talk about the case of Phineas Gage. That's a famous case study within psychology of a person who had one of the first individuals who's ever actually lived through a traumatic brain injury. He had a pole go right through his head and lived to tell the tale. But it was one of the first examinations of the what happens when there's destruction to the prefrontal cortex, which we see now when people have frontal head injuries, mostly in vehicular accidents where their head hits something and they have prefrontal cortex damage, and how that changes their personality. So this is one of the first cases that's featured in this video, as it would be because it's such a famous case. And then we start looking at some of the brain structures. Here's some interesting factoids about the brain, which is the human brain is the largest brain of all vertebrates compared to body size, weighs about 3.3 pounds, about 1,274 cubic centimeters. There's about 2% of the human body weight, just kind of skipping around here. 86 billion nerve cells, the gray matter, and it contains billions of nerve fibers, axons, and dendrites, usually covered with myelin. And there are over 100 trillion connections or synapses. So if you think about that, like kind of in computer language, transistors and what, and connections and ones and zeros in terms of how how information is processed. That's a lot of connections that we use in the brain's incredibly complex part of our bodies. So here we have a graphic kind of looking at the what we call the lobes of the brain. This is functional areas of the brain, the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, here kind of where your headphones would go. Then you have the occipital lobe in the back of your head processing lots of visual information. The temporal lobe, language and comprehension. The cerebellum, very oriented around coordination and voluntary movement. And the brainstem, which is all the kind of autonomic systems, things that are happening automatic, things like breathing, digestion, the kind of like and even some of the spinal cord reactions, like say the patellar reflex, like on your knee when they do the little hammer thing. That goes right, that actually doesn't even get processed in the brain. It gets processed right in the spinal cord and sends out, and that's where you get the kick happening there. That's why it's a test of the functioning of your peripheral nervous system, not a test of your central nervous system. So you can look at that graph to kind of see what each part of the brain does. And here's some further explanations. And then we go into the inside of the brain, the limbic system, very, very, in terms of evolutionary psychology, they consider this the mammalian brain, that these structures appeared in terms of the sequence of the development of animals on the earth, where these structures appeared in mammals. And they kind of the center for motivation, emotional processing, and essentially the emotional centers. When we look at emotion, the limbic system is portrayed in the Pixar movie Inside Out. What you're looking at is the limbic system. The characters of the emotions are parts of the limbic system, the control board, and its connection to memories and the emotional content of that. It's actually an incredible creative way of understanding the human limbic system and how it affects us. And they portray that actually very well in that movie. So we can again look at a large graphic here that talks about these inner parts of the limbic system and their functions. So the hypothalamus, temperature, hunger, fatigue, sleep, the amygdala, memory, decision-making, and emotional responses, the thalamus, regulation of sleep, consciousness, and alertness, and the basal ganglia, control of movements, learning, habit, cognition, and emotion. And so some very, very cool stuff. And then we go into here, the last little thing, some ways to explore left brain and right brain, and a nice graphic on that as to this idea that that people's personalities can be somewhat understood by understanding whether right-brained or left-brained. And so we have left brain functions, kind of logical and analytical, and then right brain functions, holistic thought and intuition, creativity, and all that. The truth is, there really isn't, there is some lateralization of the brain in terms of function, but when we engage in activities such as drawing or creative or on the other side, logical problem solving, the whole brain lights up. The notion of that we only use a certain percentage of our brain is totally myth. We use our whole brain. We use it well. Our brain is a well-oiled machine. Usually, we'll get into brain disorders later in the class, but it's kind of fun to look at some of these theories and say right brain and see if it corresponds to your handedness. So keeping in mind that the lateralization of the brain is that the left part of the brain actually controls the right side of the body. So a person who's right-handed may, not always, have left brain dominance. And so they would be more astute at analytical thought, logic, science and math, planning, those kinds of things. Then you have our left-handers would be right brain dominant, and we might assume that that's holistic thought, creativity, art, and music, and all that stuff. But clearly, it's not that way. It really isn't. That's not as concrete as it is. But it's a fun kind of way to say, well, for me, I have skills on both sides, but I am definitively right-handed, and I'm right-footed. If I'm playing soccer, I certainly have a dominant right foot. And kind of figure that out. How does that work for you? How does it seem that you are right-brained or left-brained? And there's some tests to take on that and whatnot. So we enter into the part of the class here, again, looking at, there's a bunch of stuff about the brain and learning. Read all that. That's kind of extra information. And then spinal cord injuries and how that affects our mobility, depending on where the injuries occur. The higher up the injuries occur, and they'll say, they'll have a T1 or a C4, C6 or something like that, or an L1, and we're looking actually at these determinations of where did the damage occur and what functions are therefore inhibited by that. So the functions below. So if somebody was as it says in here, we're looking at, say, someone's a T6 injury, that is the thoracic, kind of the ones that go on the outside curve right up between your shoulder blades and then down to like about the bottom of your lungs. Right there, you get an injury there, and you will very likely be a paraplegic, which is an individual who has lost the functioning below that. They can still have functioning of their hands. If somebody has a much higher, let's say up into the cervical areas, we're looking at individuals that incredibly disabled by that, not able to operate all of their hands, all of their limbs, and possibly not even able to breathe on their own. So very, very, very destructive results of that kind of injury. So let's go into the discussions. We have a discussion on right and left brain, that it is a fallacy, but still fun to talk about. And so let's talk about what that means to you. And then we have a quiz, and the quiz is actually, I didn't list the questions, but it's kind of questions about the brain functioning and parts of the brain and what they do. There's kind of a review of kind of the information of the smaller, micro aspects of what we've been talking about, and then the macro aspects. If this touches you, and you like this stuff, I would really encourage you to take the biopsychology class. We go into much more detail in terms of the functionings of the brain and the functioning of the entire body as it interacts with the brain. So that's it for today. I will see you online and in the discussion boards.